Good evening. Well, thank you so much for coming this evening, and thank you especially to Chanel and to the Canadian Women's Foundation for inviting me back. I was actually here 5 years ago when this program was launched, and among the differences of the past 5 years is 5 years ago it was the G8 in Toronto. Do any of you remember that? There was actually like a big concrete wall around downtown Toronto, but I know that is the least of what has changed in 5 years, and I'm really excited to hear from some of the participants, the grantees, about how their lives have been transformed by the work of the Canadian Women's Foundation. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the big picture. Now, it's almost, very nearly, finally, summer. And we all know what that means. That means election season. And that means that we are going to be hearing a lot about the middle class. Now, I know we're all here today to talk about women and poverty, but I think it's also useful to think about how we think about the alternative to poverty, like what is the not in poverty, right? And one of the best definitions I've ever heard of the middle class actually has nothing to do with income deciles, you'll be happy to hear. It actually has to do with how we feel. Miles Korak, who works on intergenerational poverty, defines the middle class in part as having a sense of security, having a sense of control over your life, and having a sense of hope for the future, that you will continue to be secure and that you will be able to do better in the future. So when we talk about being excluded from the middle class, we're not just talking about not having enough to make ends meet, although we are doing that. We're not just talking about incomes and employment levels, although I will talk about those things as well. We're also talking about living with constant insecurity, living without control over the most basic necessities in your life, without control over whether or not you're going to be able to pay the rent this month, or whether or not you're going to have enough for groceries by the time the 30th rolls around. And about having little hope that that's actually going to change tomorrow or the next day or the day after that. As the work of the Canadian Women's Foundation demonstrates so ably, when you give women access to adequate and stable incomes, you do more than move them from one bar on an economist graph to another. I'm making jokes about economists because I work with economists, and they're not here to defend themselves. The other thing you do is you increase her sense of security, her sense of confidence, and her sense of control over her own life, her sense of hope for the future. So I know you're going to be hearing more about the work of the foundation from the grantees and from some of the staff of the foundation. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about, more broadly, what the context is for women in poverty in Canada today. Women are more likely to live in poverty than men are. That's true today. It's been true for decades. What makes us middle class? I forgot my slide already. So the red bar is percentage of women in poverty. The gray bar is the percentage of men in poverty, and that's 30 years. So you can see where the economic recessions are. So you can pretty much tell where 2008 is. It's where it goes bonk and then back up. But you see the gap is pretty consistent. Now, that in itself doesn't seem, it's not extraordinary. The gap is about 2%. That doesn't seem, it's a bit, of course, if we look at Aboriginal women, women with disabilities, racialized women, immigrant women, we'll see higher levels of poverty there. And we also see the gap widen for women over the age of 65, at much higher rates of poverty than do men over 65. But what is particularly surprising to me from kind of a math point of view is that women's employment rates have grown phenomenally over the same 30 years. So we have today 2.5 million more women in the workforce than we did 30 years ago. And their incomes have also grown over the past 30 years. So it's kind of striking that actually women's levels of poverty haven't just fallen equally dramatically in line with that level of employment and income. Because, men's incomes have been pretty stagnant over the last 30 years, and their employment levels have been pretty stagnant. And so you would think that their bar graph would look a little different than women's levels of poverty. But in fact, it doesn't. It follows pretty much the same path. So what does that mean? And why is that? Why do we see that persistence of women's poverty in spite of the fact that so many more women are in the workforce, working hard, their incomes are going up, however slowly? Why do we still see this? Well, one of the reasons that we still see this level of poverty for women is that even though women are in the workforce looks very different for women. The economy looks very different for women. Another thing that politicians like to talk about is the economy and jobs and economic growth, GDP, right? And your eyes start to go back in your head, tax policy. But the truth is, women, all of those things look different if you're a man or a woman. Women work in very different sectors of the economy. We still have a pretty segregated economy. They do different kinds of jobs. They work different numbers of hours, fewer numbers of hours on average than men, and they do it for different rates of pay, i.e. less pay than men. Women are twice as likely to work for minimum wage as men in Canada. They are 3 times as likely to work part-time. And they are almost 100% likely to be paid less than the man sitting next to them. And at the end of the day, what that means is that women, even women in the workforce, even women working very hard, don't make enough to make ends meet. So there are over 600,000 women right now working for minimum wage in Canada, and nearly half of them are over the age of 35. So this is not the teenager with a summer job anymore, right? These are women who probably have children. They're women in middle age who are struggling, and they are making $11.25 an hour in Ontario. Now, if you're working full-time at minimum wage, you will make just under $22,000 a year. So I want you to keep that $22,000 a year in, just hold on to that for a second, making you do math. Now, Statistics Canada measures a kind of what they call a market basket of goods. So basically the things you need to survive. But it's rent and it's food and it's sort of very basic services. And they measure it for different cities. So you can imagine Toronto is a little higher than others. So in Toronto, for a family of 2, the market basket measure, what it would cost just to purchase your basic necessities is $27,000 a year, okay? So remember that $22,000, that leaves you coming up $5,000 short. That $5,000, if you make $22,000 a year, that's almost a quarter of your income. So imagine what your own income is. Told you I'd make you do more math. And imagine if that amount you were short by and you had to make up every year just to pay the rent, just to buy groceries, just to buy a snowsuit, right? Shoes, all of those things. Right? It's $5,000, if you're me and you have your Swish researcher job, that's not so much. But if you're making $22,000 a year, that is a really, really big shortfall. So even if you were working all the hours that God and Tim Hortons gave you, you are still coming up short. Now imagine for a second, Debbie Downer, imagine for a second you lose your job, all right? So you're making very little to begin with. You're not making enough to make your basic necessities. So forget this TSFAs and the RSP. You do not have money to put in savings, right? So there's no nest egg somewhere to fall back on. Okay? Your employment insurance, even though hopefully you qualify, your hours qualify, and if you make less than $25,000 a year, EI will top you up to 80%. But if 100% of your income wasn't enough to make ends meet, 80% isn't going to cut it either. So what happens? You take the very first job you can find. You don't wait 2, 3, 4 weeks for a full-time job, for a permanent job, for a job that pays more than $11.25, right? And so you're back in that cycle. So what happens when that job comes up? Well, you can only hang out on EI for so long, so you take the first job again, right? And so you end up in this vicious cycle where you're just continually taking the first job that you could get because you can't afford to wait, and that ends up being precarious work, it ends up being low wage work, it ends up in some cases being part-time work. This is why it is so important that we have programs like those supported by the Canadian Women's Foundation. And it's why it is also important that we have better public policy. Public policy that works for women as well as for men. Because it is possible to move women out of poverty. I know you know that because you're here tonight. And that's a fact that we're all going to celebrate here tonight. But the answers to how we move women out of poverty are specific to women. Women, yes, men face barriers to moving out of poverty, absolutely, but they are specific barriers as well. We can't pretend like men and women aren't situated differently in the economy. And that means that when we think about how to move and support women who are trying to move out of poverty, we need to think about the specific barriers that they face. We can't treat everyone the same. I know there's kind of this kind of Canadian thing of like everyone, we have to treat everyone the same because that's nice, but actually it's much nicer to recognize the differences that in the challenges that people face. So what are the specific challenges that women face? Well, one is the wage gap. That is the difference between what men and women get paid for doing essentially the same work. The wage gap, we hear, I don't know, did anyone watch the Oscars? Patricia Arquette she got the Best Actress Oscar, and she gave a big shout out to the wage gap. And immediately the response, well, okay, everyone went, woo! But then the next response was, well, she makes a ton of money. It's not like, things are so hard if you're Patricia Arquette. But the reason the pay gap matters is if you're at the wrong end of the wage spectrum, if you're not at the Patricia Arquette end of the wage spectrum, then you're back down at that $22,000 trying to make up that extra $5,000 that's going to make the difference between having enough and not having enough. So for example, to give you a concrete example, if you take salespersons, right? The average wage, the average income for someone working in retail sales for a woman is $12,000 a year. For men, it's $19,000 a year. Now that's still not enough. That's still not enough. But what a difference that $7,000 would make to the woman who is making $12,000, right? And that is the wage gap. That is the wage gap where it matters the most, where it really makes a substantial difference in the ability of people who are working to meet their most basic needs. Now, I am the last person in the universe to say that education is a bad idea. I had spent enough years in school. My parents thought I would never leave school. And it is absolutely true that incomes go up with education. But a question I get asked often when I'm talking about the wage gap, especially by reporters, is, well, doesn't all those women in university, doesn't that fix the wage? No, it doesn't, actually. Women in university still make less than men with university degrees. And in fact, what we see in all kinds of training programs is that just like the workforce, men and women are training in different fields. They're doing different kinds of training at every level, whether it's college, trades, university. They're training in different fields. So, for example, if you look at women in the trades, the two areas women are most likely to complete training in the trades are hairdressing and food preparation. For men, it's as plumbers and electricians. All right, so, fair enough, whatever. Rather cut hair than, deal with people's toilets. Can't blame you. But the problem with that is that we value the work that women train and then perform less than we value the work that men do. So once you've finished your training in the trades of identical length, right, and you've done your apprenticeship of the identical amount of time, if you are a hairdresser working full-time, you will earn on average $22,000 a year. If you are a plumber working full-time, can you guess? You will make $55,000 a year on average. These are numbers from our census. More than double, right? So closing the wage gap, closing the wage gap, closing the gap between how we value financially, how we reward men and women's work, can make a life-changing difference, not only to women working for unlivably low wages, but also in terms of moving women into higher income levels. This means we have to look at both moving women into those male-dominated fields, because who wouldn't like to make $55,000 a year rather than 22? But it also means paying women more in the fields that they work in. So we need more women plumbers, and I'm sorry, your haircut just got a little more expensive. The next thing that we need to do, lose this, find the slides, okay, is address the employment gap. So even though we have that additional 2.5 million women in the workforce, we still don't have as many women in the workforce as we have men. And this gap, you can see, it's closing, right? Women are doing a lot to catch up, but it's been stagnating a little bit lately. And the reason that this is also particularly striking is during the same period, women's levels of education have just gone up and up and up and up and up and up, right? At every level. So yes, men still outnumber women in the trades, but women, the trend across college, SAGE, trades, university, over the last 30 years is for increasing levels of education and training for women. And yet we're not seeing quite the same level. We're seeing a bit of a flatlining of women's employment levels. So why does that happen? And we see this, I should say as well, move ahead. We see this as well, an increased gap for women of different groups, right? So it's not just that women's employment levels aren't as high as men's, but that it's even a bigger gap for women, different kinds of women. So women with disabilities, visible minority or racialized women, immigrant women, Aboriginal women. And I want to point out that for a couple of these groups, they're actually more educated than the non-groups. Not a very nice way to say it, you know what I mean? And so this isn't actually an education gap. This is an employment gap. This is I would say, a discriminatory employment gap. So why does that gap exist? Well, one thing that hasn't changed with that increase in employment over the last 30 years is the amount of unpaid work that women do. We all know this, right? How many people, on the way here, I know because I talked to somebody, dropped the kid off at soccer, did the dishes, threw in a load of laundry. Yes, okay, you're shy. I know you did, right? All right. I know, because Statistics Canada asks you every 5 years, and women are still performing about as much unpaid work as they did 20 years ago, and it's double the number of unpaid hours of work that men perform. Now, there are only 24 hours in the day. As impressive as the Canadian Women's Foundation is, they are not going to add a 25th hour to the day, although sometimes that seems like a good idea. So what that means is it puts an absolute barrier on the number of hours of paid work that women can do, and it's a different barrier than the one men have, right? Because they're doing less of it. So we have to look at the burden of unpaid work, and one of the biggest pieces of that, of course, is childcare. Now, you remember that market basket of goods, that $27,000 that it costs just to make ends meet for two people in Toronto? That didn't include childcare. So if you have a toddler in Toronto, can you guess how much a year it costs to put them in childcare on average? We did a survey.
20,000.
Oh yeah. Oh, you guys are high, actually. Okay, the average is 16,000. That's just the average for toddler, and yes, and if you go for infant, then you're right up into the 20,000. So, okay, you guys know this, right? All right, so just imagine that you're working for $11.25 an hour, right? That's not working out for you, even with subsidies. And let me add, not only, subsidies are great, but you have to go in with your tax receipts and your gas bill and your hydro and right? Not only is there that, you don't have enough hours of work to do, you have to do that. But then you have to find a subsidized spot, right? And we already know we have a massive shortfall in terms of the spaces available for anyone who's willing to pay any price for a childcare spot in Toronto, never mind a subsidized spot. So what happens when you make childcare available and affordable? Well, we know. We have a natural experiment right here in Canada. In 1997, Quebec introduced what is now slightly more than $7 a day childcare. That works out to less than $2,000 a year. Are we all moving to Quebec? Yes. And it's the same for everyone, right? So there's no paperwork. The idea in Quebec is the difference comes out of your income tax. So if you're wealthier, you pay more income tax. That goes into the same pot, and then everyone pays $7 a day. What happened in Quebec when they introduced this? The impact on employment levels for single mother households. In 1996, the year before the child care program was introduced, 38% of single mothers of young children were employed. Today, 68% are employed, right? There's a 30% increase in the employment of single mothers. And you'll be unsurprised to know that the poverty rate for single female parent households has gone from 52%, so more than half in 1996, to 31% today. So it's declined by 20%. And what that means in raw numbers is that 104,000 single mothers moved out of poverty. Now, we can't say every single one of those women moved out of poverty because of childcare, but it's a very clear trend. And if you look at other countries that have similar kinds of programs, you see exactly the same trend. Finally, we need to keep in mind that while poverty is not a life sentence, staying in the middle class is not a certainty. And that is why the mentorship and the leadership training that the Canadian Women's Foundation supports is so crucial. Again, this isn't just about moving people from one income decile to another on somebody's chart, right? This is about quality of life. This is about knowing that you make enough to make ends meet. It's also about that feeling of security, that sense that you have control over your own life, and that you have hope for the future, that you know that you can make things better. Mentorship and the sense of community that are fostered through programs like the Women's Leadership Institute are crucial to this. And I want to say this is not just about, I've been lucky enough to be a mentor, and I always feel ridiculous when someone calls a mentor. Actually, it makes me feel really old. But also, the woman that I was mentoring was more or less the same age, and really I had more to learn from her than she did from me, and I'm not just saying that, really, I really did. But actually, to me, I think one of the most important things you can do is create a cohort, is create a network. Because we all need this, right? At the end of the day, yes, you need someone to help you with a job interview. You need someone to read your CV. You need someone to help you with those kinds of things. But you also need someone to call at the end of the day and say, oh my God, you cannot believe what someone at work just said to me today, right? To create that sense that, no, I'm not the only one, I'm not crazy, this is my life, this is the life of other people, we have the same experience, yes, we're here, yes, sometimes it feels weird, I have someone to talk to about that. Right? That cohort, that sense of community is really crucial to helping people feel that sense of security and control over their own lives. So I've talked a lot about women in poverty, I've talked about how women need each other, but I want to finish today by saying we need women. Canada needs women. Politicians, take note. If you took women out of the Canadian economy, you would remove the most important source of income, of growing household incomes. The reason that household incomes have grown over the last 20 years, male incomes have been flat. It's because women are going to work. You would remove the driving force, and it's not just me that says this, it's fancy people at Goldman Sachs and those kinds of folks that say this. You would remove the single biggest driver of economic growth in Canada over the last 20 years. Take women out of the workforce and watch hospitals try to function without 93% of their nurses, without half of their physicians. Watch schools try to work without their teachers, and watch the service industry try to function without servers. Women need women, but politicians need women too, and the Canadian economy needs women too. They need to hear the voices of women. They need to hear the voices of women who know what it's like to be not just in the middle class, but outside of the middle class, looking in. Women who know more about the barriers to economic security because they have climbed over them. Women who know more about which programs work and which policies fail because the quality of their lives depends on that success and that failure. Women who understand the differences among them, because they live those differences every day. So to the Canadian Women's Foundation, and above all, to the women who have made it, thank you. Not for what you've done for yourselves, which is admirable, but what you've done for all of us. Thank you.